underpowered against other creature decks in some matchups. So that plus having Walks on Spider to me is kind of an indication he's expecting a lot more aggressive decks.
All right, well, we are going to bring you into the match. This is underway between Braun Duin's Boros Devotion deck and Edward Redmond, as we mentioned, playing green-white aggro. We do have a Soldier of the Pantheon on the battlefield for Redmond. That was his only play. Brian, actually, with the more creatures on the board, he has Precinct Captain into Spear of Heliod.
And you see Edward with a Selesnya Guildgate in play. That's actually one of the major weaknesses of Selesnya in my mind, is the mana base is not great. It does naturally improve a little bit in a couple weeks when it has access to a Scryland, but for now, you know, it's playing Soldier of the Pantheon and Experiment 1. It has a lot of double mana in both directions, so the mana base is definitely not ideal.
Well, the Precinct Captain's going to connect, and thanks to Spear of Heliod, that's going to leave Brian with a 3/3 and a 2/2. Bring Edward a little on the back foot. He's going to go ahead and, looks like, make a Luxodon Smiter, so he will have a blocker up this next turn.
And this is one of those good slots for Smiter. When you're brawling on the ground, it's pound for pound one of the best threats.
Yeah, so it's going to go toe-to-toe with Brian's own 3-drop, though. It's Boros Reckoner, which, thanks to Spear, once again, is the large creature on the board. And we see cast from Edward's hand, though, is quickly the answer. It's going to be Banisher Priest. It'll banish Boros Reckoner. And that'll put Edward, once again, with control of the battlefield for the moment.
But even with a better board presence, he can't quite attack just yet, as the Precinct Captain holds off the smaller creatures, and nor does Edward want that Precinct Captain to connect and make another token.
Yeah, so on this board, you'd say then that this is still going to, according to plan for Brian, right? He's at 20, and he's made his 5th land drop.
Yeah, well, you know, he needs to draw some action, but he certainly has no end of powerful draws from this position.
Yeah, so we see Fleece Main Lion added to the board from Edward. We actually see an Advent of the Worm hiding out in his hand as well. So it does seem, even though Brian has the larger plays in his deck, it might be that Edward has the larger cards currently in hand.
Yeah, definitely a much better presence on the board. You see him with Selesnya Charm and Advent of the Worm.
And he's going to swing with a Smiter. That deals 4. Brian's going to go ahead and use Spear of Heliod to take out the Smiter. That's a pretty aggressive attack from Edward.
Yeah. Spear of Heliod, you really don't see that activated power come up except when someone is attacking for lethal or trying to attack for lethal over 2 turns.
Do you think that was just a momentary miss there from Edward?
Potentially, yeah. Again, Spear of Heliod's second power doesn't come up a lot in Constructed, so.
And we do see 2 instants, Advent of the Worm and Selesnya Charm hiding out in Edward's hand. And we've created quite a board stall here.
Yeah, Brian definitely mulling over Edward's potential tricks, Selesnya Charm being the most likely of them.
Yeah, well, so I guess the question would be, can he attack with Precinct Captain right now?
Well, if he suspects that the last card in his hand is, or one of the cards in his hand is a Selesnya Charm, then no, he has no good attacks. But
yeah. He's going to chain the Fleece Main Lion to the rocks. He manages to get that down actually before Edward can monstrous the Fleece Main Lion. And nick those from Brian, and now he's contemplating whether or not he wants to make that call on Selesnya Charm. He does have the 3/3 first strike Precinct Captain. If there's no Selesnya Charm, Edward would be forced to chump.
Brian can also test the waters here by just attacking with the token.
Right, so yeah, with the token, that at least is pretty much a free 2 damage.
Or it trades with the card, which Brian is probably happy with, no matter what that card is.
It looks like he's going to go with at least a token. Will Precinct Captain be joining? That's the question. As you said, just the 2/2s. He's going to go ahead and test for a trick. And Edward will not show it to him. He goes down to 15.
Yep. So Brian leaving the first striker back on defense, trying to hold off Edward's team here.
And we see another Selesnya Charm, it looks like. Started with a triple instance, going to go ahead and pass the turn back on 5 mana. That'll bring us back to Brian's turn. Brian with 6 lands, one of them is a Nykthos, which he added last turn, draws another Nykthos, so no shortage of mana. He currently has 5 Devotion to white, but nothing to cast with it.
Yeah, Brian currently choked on some legendary permanents with an additional Spear in his hand, an additional copy of Nykthos. But again, Spear of Heliod plus a first striking Precinct Captain actually does a lot to hold off Edward's board here. It's really hard for him to attack piecemeal because the Spear can shoot things down. It's also hard for him to alpha strike because the Precinct Captain and the token in play are fairly large.
All right, so the end step, there was that worm made from Edward. He drew for the turn. His draw was Boon Satyr. So he is going to, looks like he's going to get attack into that spear. Brian, I assume knows something's up here. And yeah, no blocks. Boon Satyr will deal a whopping 9 damage, bringing Brian down to 7 life.
And this may be a spot where Edward doesn't actually care about spear getting used. This is a lot of damage. He still gets the Boon Satyr left over after the spear.
Yep, exactly. Brian's going to use the spear to go ahead and take out the worm token, but the damage has been done, Brian, at 7 life. But once again, it looks like stabilized on the board.
Yes. Precinct Captain the draw for Brian here. This actually potentially allows him to attack with the Precinct Captain already in play. Edward basically has to triple block to effectively get this off of the table. And if Banisher Priest gets involved in combat, then Brian gets back his Boros Reckoner. So,
well, I think one of the interesting things about this white-red devotion deck actually is that he has the potential to make a really big first strike wall. We see Boros Reckoner, Precinct Captain, second Precinct Captain, Spear of Heliod. You know, when they're all on the table, he actually can have 10 power worth of first strike on defense. So a swing with both creatures from Brian. Precinct Captain will go unblocked, putting Edward down to 12. The Soldier token was traded away with the Soldier of the Pantheon, and is replaced by a new Soldier token from Precinct Captain.
And Brian's flooding out pretty badly this game. Again, he's sort of choking on some redundant permanents. You can see there's a lot of really annoying cards in his deck for an aggressive deck to face down. Precinct Captain, Boros Reckoner, the removal spells. There's a lot to slog through.
And the question is whether or not Edward will be able to do it. He does have 2 Selesnya charms, so he can almost try to just trample over enough damage. He's right now a tad short. And he's going to go ahead with both attacks. This is Boon Satyr and Banisher Priest, and Brian has to know something's up here.
Yeah, and Brian, he's played the game a couple turns ago where he was clearly thinking about Selesnya Charm. It's definitely on his radar.
All right, so we see Soldier token is going to go ahead and block Banisher Priest. Precinct Captain in front of Boon Satyr. He's going to force Edward to have the tricks, and Edward has both of them. Selesnya Charm giving both creatures 2/2 and trample will make both the trades go in Edward's favor.
So I believe we have 5 damage coming across in this sequence.
Yeah, it's going to be 3 trampling from the Boon Satyr and 2 more trampling from the Banisher Priest. That'll put Brian down to 2. Though he is going to get another Spear of Heliod activation.
Yep.
And what are your thoughts then? Is this, Edward's done some damage, but he wasn't able to do the whole life total. Was this a good swing then?
Well, the green-white aggro deck actually has quite a few ways to close the game out with things like Mistcutter Hydra. It has additional pump spells, Advent of the Worm. So it actually has a little bit more reach than you generally anticipate out of a green-white deck. That said, the Spear is now activated 3 times. Edward's board is definitely whittled, and now you see Brian pick up a Heliod here as well to further lock down the board. So definitely some aggressive attacks from Edwards. He does have some draws here to finish the game, but he has lost a lot of his board to that Spear of Heliod.
All right, and now we see Nykthos mana being made, so we check Devotion to White. That is a devotion of 8, so this is 8 white, 8 white mana for Brian. And it's going to be Heliod, God of the Sun, with 4 additional mana. He'll be able to make a 2/1 immediately.
Certainly the least played of the gods thus far in Standard, making an appearance in round 1.
Well, this is actually the part of the white devotion deck that I'm really excited about. It's like I said, that first strike wall. A Vigilance first strike wall can be really difficult for an aggro deck to get past.
Oh, certainly, yeah.
All right, and there will be our attack. That's 7 damage from Boros Reckoner and Precinct Captain. We'll put it totals at 2 and 5, and a Soldier being made for Brian.
And Brian, again, he drew very few spells this game. His draw was not very good. He drew a second Nykthos, a second Spear of Heliod, kind of flooded out a little bit, but the cards that he has played so far against this deck have been very high impact.
Yeah, and we see on Edward's face his draw was a Plains. He knows he's close, but I don't know if he can find that last 2 damage, depending on what the card in his hand is. And he's looking for the damage also.
So you're seeing another end of turn activation here from Heliod, putting some more tokens into play.
Yeah, and that's thanks Brian did play a second Nykthos that turn, replacing the tapped Nykthos with an untapped one, which allowed him then to make those 2 additional spirit enchantment tokens. And a swing from Brian. Another Boonsater will flash into play for Edward, but will it be enough? Almost certainly not. We have 7 attacking creatures. Edward at 5. 5 of them go unblocked, and that'll be game 1 to Brian Braun Duin.
Spirit of Heliod plus Heliod, just how they drew it up in R&D, as you see Brian take down the first game. Looking over the sideboard right now, Brian's has a sideboard of 3 Perforos, and 4 copies of Assemble Legion. This, to me, is give it a little more game against control decks, convert it into more of a Perforos plus token plan that we saw win the Open last weekend. An additional Midgame Mortars, an additional Angel of Serenity, 2 Pithing Needles, 2 Glare of Heresies, and 2 Last Breaths. I would anticipate the additional Mortars coming in, the additional Angel, the 2 Glares, and potentially the 2 Last Breaths as well.
Yeah, so as you said before, the white-red Devotion deck is a little more of a control deck than you've seen in the past out of Devotion, and I think his sideboard lets him pursue that control strategy even more. You know, you said 3 Midgame Mortars in the main becomes 4. The Angel can come in, and like we saw, Glare of Heresy, Last Breath.
And over on Edward's side?
Well, on Edward's side, he has... So he can go for bigger creatures. I mean, certainly against a mono-white Devotion deck, you have to assume he's boarding into Glare of Heresies. Other than that, some of his cards, he has Fade into Antiquity, which could take out a god. I think he did see Heliod and a Spear that game.
And Chain of the Rocks as well. So a lot of targets for Fade and Antiquity.
Right, so he can board that in, and Fades and Glares. Outside of that, there are cards which he could board in. He has Pelucranos and Unflinching Courage. I'm not positive that either of those would come in the matchup.
Yeah, you can imagine spots where Unflinching Courage could actually be very good. Brian, you know, he has good blockers in play. He can chump block a lot with Precinct Captain and such. But definitely the presence of Chain of the Rocks makes bringing in a card like Unflinching Courage dubious at times as well.
Yeah, because his Chain, and especially as we saw how much damage Spear of Heliod did that last game, that's another card that you really would prefer not to play an aura against.
Right. So anyhow, going on to the second game here, Brian Braun Duin up game 1 with his basically mono-white Devotion deck, splashing a couple red cards against Edward Redmond playing green-white aggro.
Yeah. So, especially with the green-white decks, it can be a little difficult to be resistant to a card like Spear of Heliod. When I was trying to think, you know, how he would have gotten out of that lock. You know, Spear of Heliod, you said it was activated 3 times in one game, which is really huge for a card like that. But if you're Edward, he kind of, that game, you know, plowed into Spear. He tried to just overload it with damage. And I'm not sure he actually has another game plan that he can do to address it. Other than, you know, he has 2 Fade into Antiquities, but he can't count on drawing one of those every game.
Yeah, the plan that he can try to execute is just to build up a huge board and attack in one turn to try to kill Brian. That's obviously fraught with peril in a couple places. The threat of Midgame Mortars getting overloaded can ruin you if you build up too big of a board. You're giving Brian time to find powerful cards like Heliod, like Angel of Serenity. But the traditional way to try to beat a card like Spirit of Heliod is wait until you have one big turn and try to push through that. But Brian has a lot of tools to make that not an easy game plan to execute. I think the second and third attacks from Edward were both fine. I think it was that first attack where he ran the smiter in for 4 damage.
Yeah, the 20 to 16.
That was the one attack where he might have been better served waiting for a spot where he could have attacked with more things. If you're just joining us, round 1 of the Star City Games Open here in Baltimore, Maryland. I'm Patrick Sullivan with Matthias Hunt. And we have a lot of standard action, 10 rounds, 642 players in attendance. And we are starting off with Brian Braun Duin with his Mono White Devotion deck. He actually wrote about this Devotion deck in the premium newsletter. If you're a premium subscriber, you would have seen that. We'll also be doing a deck tech with him later today over the sideboard, so he and Ruben Bresler will be talking about his deck as well.
He said he gave it the nickname Sunny Delight in his deck tech on it, I believe.
Not feeling it.
I'm not
feeling
the white mana, the sun symbol.
I get it. I mean, I get it, but I'm not, you know.
The problem I have is that Sunny Delight is orange.
Right.
See, so it's mono white deck. Yeah, there's a little bit of conflict there.
Yeah. So you see both players here take a mulligan.
Yeah, both players down to 6. Possibly something that favors green-white aggro. In general, the Devotion decks can be pretty difficult on the mulligan. Less cards means less ways to assemble, your devotion combo, I think.
You're more likely to be either missing an enabler or missing your big payoff card.
Right. A lot of the devotion decks are ramp decks to a certain point.
Yeah. Now, that said, the green-white aggro deck does have pretty sketchy mana. So that is a thing I've seen on camera come up a few times where mulligans have really harmed this deck.
And that's really the interesting thing is that we see this, a straight 2-color deck in a format where it has access to 8 full dual lands, and yet we still say that these decks have bad mana.
Oh, it's definitely a sensitivity thing. You see a deck like blue-white has 4 Guild Gates and 4 Hollow Fountains.
That's great mana.
Great mana because you don't need both colors of mana on turn 1. You have a lot of ways to catch up. You can be missing colored mana for a while and then cast Supreme Verdict, and then it's fine. You've caught up for those couple turns. The green-white deck is playing green and white creatures that are low mana and low impact later in the game. So it really needs to have green and white mana early on.
Yeah, it's like, so you need, the turn 1 soldier into turn 2 Fleece Mane, for example. And you need, to make that play, you need a plains followed by a forest and nothing else. All right, both players keeping on 6. We do see Fade into Antiquity and Smiter in Edward's hand.
I believe Brian kept a hand of 6 lands, one of which was a scry land.
Oh, wow, so all mana for Brian. And it looks like his first draw was a land. He finally has his first permanent in Boros Reckoner. It looks like he's found another spell. Not sure if he wants to keep it. He has some time, though. Edward actually didn't make any play on turn 1 or 2.
And if you want to know the power of the scry lands, I mean, you're seeing it right here. That keep from Brian there is impossible, that 6-card hand, if we're looking at 6 non-scry lands.
So we see Smiter is the turn 3 play for Edward Redmond. Change to the Rocks is the draw for Brian. He does have the mountain for it, but he's going to go ahead and play Boros Reckoner first.
And we're in that place, like we mentioned before, where overloading mortars could come up in this game, even though Brian's deck is primarily white.
Yeah, he actually does have triple red already. So Edward's going to go ahead and offer the potential trade of 3 drops. He's swinging Smiter into Boros Reckoner, and Brian wants no part of the trade. He will take it to 16.
Brian with Chain of the Rocks in hand, so trying to pick a better spot, maybe untap with his Reckoner and first strike mana, maybe lock out more of Edward's team here as you see Brian pick up another land.
Yeah, and it looks like we've seen boarded in for Edward is the Pelucranos from his sideboard. So he did have 2 Pelucranos in his sideboard, presumably boarding it in because it's a creature matchup here.
Also, if you suspect Mizium Mortars could be in your opponent's deck, it's another threat that dodges that.
Yeah, well, Pelucranos will be changed down to the Rocks. Brian will play a Sacred Boundary and pass back to Edward. So keeping the board somewhat clean, but Edward does have both an Advent and Fade for that change to the Rocks. Yep. So Brian's going to need a few more answers.
He's going to need to pick up one of his big draws here. Particularly Angel of Serenity would be very good in this game, the way it's shaping up.
All right, land 5. And look, I'm thinking Edward's going to go ahead and, with a drawn Banisher Priest, take care of Boros Reckoner, and that will put Brian on the defensive. Down to 12 as Lux and Smiter crashes through the now empty board of Brian. And speaking of one of those high-impact cards, I think we have Mizium Mortars.
And now Brian has to debate whether or not he has to fire this off right now or if he can afford to wait one more turn.
Yeah, well, if he waits one more turn, he goes down to 6. There are a few cards in Edward's deck that can 6 him. The End-Step Advent and Swing is only a 5 damage spell without a card like Celestia Charm.
And it looks like Brian's going to make a move here.
Yep, so Mizium Mortars takes out Banisher Priest. Boros Reckoner comes back onto the battlefield to play defense. And another land for Brian. So yeah, Brian's left actually with a hand of just 2 plains. He determined that 6 was just too much of a risk.
With all the pump spells and haste creatures in the green-white aggro deck, not a bad spot to pick to just, clean up the board a little bit, get your Reckoner back, and just trade.
Yeah, so the third swing from Smiter came there from Edward. This time Brian accepted the trade as Boros Reckoner and Smiter fought it out. Both are in the graveyard, and now the board is just Pelucranos as the Chain to the Rocks faded into Antiquity.
Brian drew a Mortars that turn, which does nothing against the Pelucranos in play.
No, 5/5, and that's what you were saying, why one of the reasons Edward might want to board in Pelucranos here was because of Mizium Mortars. You see right now, it's turning out to be a strategy which has paid off. Brian's going to go ahead and take its 5 damage here. It puts him to 7. It's actually a 1-turn clock from Pelucranos. If need be, Edward can monster sit next turn.
And remember also Advent's still in hand.
Right.
So Edward just cranking out the 5/5s this game.
Yeah, Brian's draw was Precinct Captain, but he is currently dead to the board if he makes Precinct Captain. And he certainly, if not dead to the board, is dead to this Advent of the Worm.
See. I imagine that Edward is going to be going into attack here. No blocks, and there's a concession from Brian.
All right, so we'll be on to game 3 here. Edward Redmond able to take down game 2, thanks really to just a unending stream of really large creatures. It started with Smiter, continued into Pelucranos, then ended with a Worm token.
Yeah, a lot of 5/5s, a lot of heavy hitters, a lot of play at instant speed too in the green-white aggro deck, which is another source of its power. For an attacking deck, it actually is pretty tricky and can play a lot on the opponent's turn. Voice of Resurgence helps facilitate this a little bit. Now, you've seen Brian in both of these games draw a lot of mana. He has gotten a little unlucky, but keep in mind he has 26 lands in his deck, so it's very mana heavy, very mana hungry as well.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time, you know, he did keep a 6-land hand, and that is one of the dangers of keeping, when you have a hand with so many lands, that pretty much every time you draw a land from that point out, it's like you're missing a draw.
Yeah, only Angel of Serenity is, and Heliod are the cards that can kind of catch him back up and use all of that mana, but...
Right, so with a hand like that, you're really hoping to find one of those 2 cards.
Yeah, but again, you know, the opening hand did contain 2 scry lands. His opponent was on 6 cards as well, and mulliganing to 5 in Devotion decks is really rough, again, for the same reasons we mentioned before. You need to find a mixture of mana and enablers and big payouts, and 5 cards that's just asking a lot out of a 5-card hand.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the reasons we saw some indecision on Brian's part when he was scrying. He found that Chain to the Rocks with his 2nd scry land. He ended up keeping the Chain to the Rocks, but you could tell he was pretty unhappy with the whole situation. Because he didn't have much early game defense, he had to burn his removal immediately. Chain to the Rocks immediately hit Pelucranos. He wasn't able to overload Mizium Mortars, and because he had to scry those removal spells to the top, he wasn't able to find, like you said, the Heliod or the Angel of Serenity to close out the game.
Right, when you already have that much mana in your hand, it's not clear if you can afford to trade 1 for 1. Not that Chain of the Rocks was bad that game, it was certainly good, but when you need to find one of your high and back cards, can you afford to take something like Chain of the Rocks there?
Right, it's like you almost want to scry anything that is not one of those 2 cards to the bottom.
Right.
And both players, neither of them goes back to the sideboard. They are quickly on to game 3. This one will have Brian on the play. And we see what is a clear mulligan from Brian, who was a Mountain and Nykthos is the only lands with, I believe, double Elspeth Spear.
Yeah. This is actually pretty strange part of Brian's build here. Most of the time where you see Devotion decks, you see, you know, their mana is biased in one direction. Even if they have a second color, they're sort of splashing it off of dual lands and maybe Nykthos and hybrid mana cards.
For example, Red-White Devotion is Sacred Foundries, Boros Guild Gates, and Mountains.
Right. Brian's list actually has 8 plains, 5 mountains. He is sort of a dedicated 2-color deck, even though he's playing with Nykthos and a bunch of mono-white enablers and permanents.
So walk me through that, because I would think with a deck like his, he would be almost all plains.
Yes. I mean, it's possible that he just needs to cast Mizium Mortars early on in the game reliably because he doesn't have that much early defense. He also needs to have mountains for Chain of the Rocks. So,
right, so he actually has to have basic mountains for Chain to the Rocks to work. And out of the board, he does get Purphoros as well, though he presumably, I think, could find a red in time for Purphoros.
So Brian draws an opening hand with red and white mana, a Reckoner and a Mizium Mortar. So a solid 6-card hand.
Yeah, what I do like about his mana is that he has no shortage of duels. He has 4 Foundries, 4 Temples, and 2 Guild Gates, so 10 red-white duels. Second land into play for Brian, no plays yet, and the first play of the game will be Fleece Main Line from Edward Redmond.
I'm personally a fan of Call the Conclave in this spot, in this deck rather, as it plays well with Rootborn defenses and better against opposing Soldier of the Pantheons, but Fleece Main Lane also potentially powerful against a deck like Brian's that's trying to, gum up the ground and use a lot of removal spells.
Yeah, we see the only root runes in Redmond's deck are he has 2 in the board and none in the main right now. So I think that goes along with the inclusion of Fleece Main Line. If you're not playing the root borns in the main, maybe you don't play the calls.
Yeah. But like we talked before we went to the match here, a lot of options for green-white decks. There's no shortage of quality threats.
Right. And turn 3 play from Brian is a Reckoner. That's going to be kept on defense here. And Edward will go ahead and make Luxodon Smiter. So Brian opted not to trade the Reckoner for the Fleece Main Lion. Presumably it's because he needs the... So I was just kind of some thoughts there. He needs the Devotion. If I were in Brian's spot, I would be worried about Fleece Main Lion becoming monstrous on this board.
Yeah, I think, ultimately that Reckoner has to be worth more than that Fleece Main Lion. If you have a Nykthos in hand, it locks out a lot of Edward's future plays and also enables potentially some big draws from Brian. So
you say lock up future plays, what you mean is, so now he has 2 Reckoners. He made a second Reckoner. If you have that 6 power first strike, for example, on subsequent turns, Brian can just leave up a first strike wall and hopefully blank opponents' attacks.
That's one thing. Also, if Edward did something like add an Experiment 1 or add a Selesnya Charm token or some such, then you could potentially trade your Reckoner for 2 of his cards.
All right.
It just seemed a little early for him to make that sort of trade, so I like taking the first hit.
So we do see a swing once again from Redmond. This is with Smiter and Fleece Main. Brian's at 17 with 2 Reckoners. He can only give one of them first strike. The question for him is how much damage he wants to take. If he takes it all, he will go to 10 and presumably have to deal with a monstrous Fleece Main on the next turn. And he's going to block Boros Reckoner on the Fleece Main Lion. I think he's expecting a trick here.
Yes.
But even so, that trick should be fine. Reckoner gets first strike. This should still be a 2-for-1 for Brian.
So Selesnya Charm to give +2/+2 and trample to the Fleece Main Lion.
Right, so that means 2 damage will trample over, plus the 6 from Smiter brings Brian down to 11 life points, but there will be 5 damage for Brian to throw around when that Reckoner hits the bin. He'll be able to take out either the Lion or the Smiter, his choice.
No, well, it gives trample, so there's still only the 3 coming across to the Reckoner.
You're right, there is only 3, so he has to take care of the Lion.
Right. Still a 2-for-1, but not as juicy.
Not as juicy as taking out the Smiter. And,
right.
Yeah. So that play of the Selesnya Charm is the only play for Edward, and that gives Brian a slight reprieve here. He does have Mizium Mortars to take out the Smiter, and he could clear the board.
He also has Chain of the Rock in hand, a Precinct Captain, so he can actually start playing something of a tempo game now, using his removal and actually starting to get on the offensive a little bit.
Yeah, it looks like we're going to see just that. 2 mana. I think he's committed to killing the Smiter. He's not sure how he wants to kill it yet. He is going to go ahead and Mizium Mortars the Luxodon Smiter. And now Brian moves to the attack. Boros Reckoner enters the red zone, dealing first damage to Edward. That'll bring him down to 17.
And Brian's got to be thrilled. He's now on the front foot. He can use his Chain of the Rocks potentially next turn to free up his Precinct Captain and really start gumming up the works.
Right, so 5 power in play from Brian, all first striking. This is the Precinct Captain and Boros Reckoner. 4 lands, soon to be 5 in play for Edward, and a bunch of cards in hand, but nothing else. He had Bow of Nylea. I mean, he played a tap land and left up 4 passed the turn. I have to think Brian knows what's what right now.
Yeah, it is a suspicious attack, certainly, so.
Yeah. One of the things I love about the Advent of the Worm as a 4-mana instant is it is an instant speed card, but tricking people with it is a pretty tall order. You see, Unstopped 5/5 is made.
The notice is out on this card at this point,
Right, yeah. It's like, oh, why'd you leave up that mana? And we see legendary God Weapon followed by other God Weapon. These are both one-ofs in Edward's deck. He plays both Spear of Elad and Bow of Nylea this turn.
Well, this attack here is
very
dangerous for Edward if he actually goes through with this, as Brian has a lot of first strike on defense. He can just...
I don't think that'll kill anything.
Your 6/6 Death Touch Worm actually isn't ready to get into the red zone just yet.
And it's going to have to train for 3 turns with the Bow of Nylea before it can attack. All right, we see from Brian, Chain to the Rocks. That's going to take out the worm.
7 white. Oh.
And Archangel of Thune.
And this is
this is This is a lot of power on the board for Brian. He's going to go ahead and swing for 8. That puts Edward down to 9. Brian gets a token. And that tempo game you're talking about suddenly looks like it may be just enough to pull Brian through
And
the
if
match.
Brian couldn't lock up the board before, one hit from that Archangel, and that team now is 4-4 Boros Reckoners, 3-3 Precinct Captains. They're generating 2-2 Soldiers. So,
yeah, Archangel of Thune, as you see over there on the left, a 3-4 flying lifelink, pumps the whole team whenever it hits. Has certainly picked up stock, I would say, in the last couple weeks here.
yeah. Edward making a 5-5 here, but I think this is just going to be an easy crackback for Brian.
Yep, 5-5 has swung from Redmond. You have to think Edward tapped out, so we should, I'm expecting just to see a chump and then swing back for the win. Yeah, and he's going to wisely chump with Archangel here because that trigger from Archangel will make his next attack lethal.
Yes. I think his next attack may have been lethal anyway, but this certainly locks it up.
This is style points at the very least.
Of course.
See all the dice on Boros Reckoners. That's 4, 11, 13 damage on the board. A tapped out creatures from Edward, tapped out lands from Edward, and this attack should do it. And 2-1. Brian Braun Duin, your number 2 seed, takes round 1 here in the Standard Open in Baltimore, Maryland.
Over